How do you like that? That's fantastic, isn't it? I think we need a We Dine Together club in every high school in Chandler, Gilbert, Tempe, Queen Creek, everywhere in the East Valley. Because think about it, maybe there's not a place anywhere on earth more intimidating than when you're in high school and you go to a new high school in a new town and you go into the cafeteria for the first time, and then you try to find somewhere to sit because you've got the baseball table and the cheer table and the skater table and the gamer table and the emo table. And if you don't know anyone there, then you end up at the table that has no name, where kids just sit far apart and they don't even talk. And that's not really a table at all. Tables can be painful places of exclusion, or they can be incredible places of inclusion. The trouble is that kind of excluding, that kind of dividing doesn't end at high school. I think sometimes we see that kind of dividing in life happen in neighborhoods or in workplaces, sometimes in our living rooms and dining rooms, or even in our churches. Because of that excluding. That's why I love Jesus' metaphor. In my opinion, his favorite metaphor for the kingdom of heaven was a table and a banquet, a big old feast where everyone was invited. You have to picture the scene that Jesus arrived on 2,000 years ago. When he came into first century Israel, the Jewish people were very particular about who was allowed to eat at their tables. Life divided at the tables for the devout Jew. The table was not a place to mix and mingle with foreigners and sinners. Tables, any kind of dinner table, any kind of meal, was only for pure Jews. Jews who were spiritually pure, had no obvious sins like being sick or something like that. And it was for ethnically pure Jews. But then Jesus arrives and he's done with it. He doesn't like this kind of dividing because of nationality or ethnicity. So he comes along and he flips their tables upside down. And they're angry. They're mad at him. They cannot stand Jesus' table manners. In fact, his table manners annoy them so much they want to kill him for it. Some biblical scholars will say that the primary reason that the religious leaders killed Jesus was because they could not stand his table manners. They were offensive to everyone. But at Jesus' table, which is a picture of the kingdom of heaven that we're all invited to, he makes this statement: everyone is invited. Everyone is welcome. So take out your Bibles. We're going to be in Luke chapter 14 this morning. And so let's look at it together. I'm actually going to start by reading from Matthew chapter 22. Let's go back one slide. I want to show you this. So what I'm inviting you to do here, I have here a daring culinary adventure with Jesus. It's daring and dangerous because his table manners were so offensive, like I said, they wanted to kill him for it. So we're going to start, I'm just going to read one verse from Matthew 22, verse 1, and it's a parallel passage to Luke 14. The kingdom of heaven, Jesus says, is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet. Now move to Luke 14, verse 17. Just so you can picture the scene, Jesus has been invited to a meal by a Pharisee, a religious leader. So he's sitting here, and we read that when he sits down to eat, across the table from him is a man who is sick. So they talk about that. And then, because they don't understand his attitude towards someone being sick at the table and wanting to do something about it, he tells this story. Luke 14, verse 17. At the time of the banquet, he sends a servant to tell those who had been invited, "Come, for everything is ready." But they all alike began to make excuses. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, "Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame." "Sir," the servant said, "what you have ordered has already been done, but there is still room." Then the master told his servant, "Go out to the roads and the country lanes and compel them to come in so that my house will be full." The table, I hope you see, this table today it embodies the kingdom of heaven as Jesus came to help us understand it. And everyone was invited to his kind of table. I don't know if it's ever happened to you where you've been excluded from or felt unwelcome to a dinner. It feels really bad. It's happened to me. I write about in Barefoot Tribe a moment that I'll never forget. I had been in Malawi, East Africa with one of our Grove teams. I'd been there for like 2 weeks. And then we had another team in West Africa, about 5,000 miles away, that I wanted to go join as well. So I spent the whole day traveling, like 13, 14 hours, finally land in Liberia, find a driver who takes me to a dilapidated guest house by the beach. It was right after the Civil War. And when I arrived, there was the woman who was hosting me at the guest house. She said, she was a Liberian named Nellie. She said, hey, just down the dirt road here at the White House down the road, there's some Americans there, and they said you can come and have dinner with them tonight. And I was like, yes, I don't know how that happened. Maybe they know my dad or something. And so I took a shower and changed, and I was starving. So I walked down the dirt road next to the beach, and I get to the house, and I knock on the front door. And a young American guy, maybe around 30 or so, answers the door. He looks East Coast educated, or at least sounds that way. And he says, can I help you? And I said, yeah, I'm Palmer Chinchen. I'm here for dinner. And he says, I don't know anything about that. I said, well, let me explain. I said, well, Nellie down at the guest house, she said I should come down here, and at 6 o'clock, you guys, I could join you for dinner. And the thing is, when he opened the door, I could feel this rush of air conditioning come out. And I was like, ooh, I don't know if you know how hot Africa is. It's like Africa hot in Africa. And I had been in air conditioning for 2 weeks. And then I smelled the food, and I saw the table was set. And then, not making this up, I look inside, and there's a TV with ESPN going. Are you kidding me? I thought, this is going to be my best night in 2 weeks. And so as I'm explaining this, he says, I don't know anything about this. And I said, well, Nellie told me to come. And he said, I said, for dinner. And he says this, I'm sorry, but there's no food for you here. I was like, what? My first thought was, this nonprofit was in Africa to feed hungry people, and I was hungry. And I tried to explain. I said, you don't understand. I've been traveling all day. The driver who dropped me off, he left. I can't get to a restaurant. And he said, again, I'm sorry, there's no food for you here. Now it got really awkward, and so I was just standing there, and he's standing there, so he just slowly closed the door. And I heard the deadbolt click. And I was like, man, I was just disinvited. I don't even know if that's a word, but that's what happened. And as I walked back down the beach to my guest house, I think the shame burned more than the hunger pangs in my stomach. And I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but Jesus came to change that. For Jesus, tables were a place of inclusion. This text that I read from Matthew chapter 14, I hope it sinks in. This message that I'm sharing this morning, it's at the very core of who we are here at the Grove. It's at the very center, I think, of who we are as Christians, that the kingdom of God is for everyone, and everyone is welcome. The Jewish people could not stand Jesus' eating habits. If you remember in moments like Luke chapter 5, verse 30, they kept saying this to him, why do you keep eating with sinners and tax collectors and non-Jews? Why do you do that? They couldn't stand his table manners. Some of them, for the Jewish people, they only wanted people at their table who looked like them and talked like them and dressed like them and had the same skin tone as them and the same nationality as them. Everyone else was not welcome. I want to read to you from the Message Bible how Eugene Peterson has translated Luke chapter 14. I'm going to start in verse 12. So we read this. Jesus goes on from his conversation about the wedding banquet. He says to his host, he turned to the host, the next time you put on a dinner, don't just invite your friends and family and rich neighbors, the kind of people who return the favor. Invite some people who never get invited out, the misfits from the wrong side of the tracks. Then you'll experience a blessing. Jesus, do you see, was done with all the excluding. And he starts, and he flings open the gates of the kingdom of heaven. And he has this scandalously wide open invitation where everyone is invited and accepted and wanted and welcomed. I have this thought on the screen. I hope it goes home with you because it's central to what we're talking about today. The church, this church, but the church around the world, best represents Christ when we embrace and include people of every race, ethnicity, nationality, and background. That's how we're called to live. And then also I have this key idea, and if you don't take anything else home today, I hope this sticks with you. Jesus reminds us here in this passage that there's nothing exceptional about loving people who are like us, people who think like us, look like us, dress like us, talk just like us. That's easy. The challenge is to love and embrace people regardless, all people, regardless of their race, nationality, social status, background, or any other factor. The tables for Jesus were a place where everyone was invited. Here's a second observation I've made in looking at this Luke 14 passage about Jesus' kinds of tables, is that the table is level. Let me read this to you, and then I'll explain what I mean by this. The table is level. Luke chapter 14, verse 7. Then Jesus noticed how the guests picked their places of honor at the table. And he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor. So here's what he noticed. He noticed that when people came and sat down at the table with him, some of them sat at the head of the table. They took the seat of honor. At least in America, that's how it works. If you've noticed, we haven't put a place setting here or a place setting down here. In fact, at our 1,000-foot table, there's not a place setting and 1,000 seats at that end or at that end. Now, maybe tonight you'll want some elbow room and you'll want to move a chair over to the end. And you can go ahead and do that and be king of the world for a night, but people are going to criticize you. I won't. They're going to judge you. But you can try to be in charge. But Jesus says, at my table, everyone, it's level. Don't try to think you're better than somebody else. Why do I use that language? I think, and so I brought a level to illustrate this, because tables only work if they're level. Am I right about that? Have you ever been in a restaurant where that thing is rocking all over the place and spilling your coffee, and it's terrible? And I brought the level because I grew up in a home where our table was not like level. It was like this. You think I'm making it up? Let me explain. Most of you know that when I was about 6 years old, my family moved to Liberia, West Africa, to be missionaries. And a single-engine prop plane dropped us off in the middle of the world's thickest rainforest. There were no roads, no electricity, no running water. My pet was a chimpanzee named Tarzan, for real. And we lived in a bamboo mat house. And you're thinking it was something primitive. Let me tell you, it was a very fine bamboo mat house. The walls were made out of bamboo mat house, but we had screen on the windows. The floor was wood plank. It sat about 2 feet off the ground on stilts, I think to keep the snakes out. That didn't keep the snakes out. And it had a tin roof. But the problem was, and it was the finest house in the bush that the people built for us when we arrived. But when the carpenters built it, they built it on a hill, and behind our house was a creek. And so the land kind of sloped towards the creek, and they just built with the contour of the land. And so they didn't have a level. They just kind of eyeballed it so that the house ended up like this, all right? When you walked in the front door, like if this is the front, it made you want to just straight run out the back door. That's what you felt like, downhill. We had a Pan Am pilot come and spend a couple of nights with us once, like almost a week. And the house drove him nuts. He kept saying, I feel like I'm in descent. I feel like we're going down. We're in descent. And he wanted to pull the house back up to cruise altitude and get it level. He never could get comfortable. He couldn't stand the house. The problem with the table, though, the only problem with the house came with the table at dinner time. Because if this is uphill and this is downhill, my dad sat here, my mom sat here, and whenever my twin brother, not me, or my little sister spilled their Tang, it all went straight towards my mom. It all went downhill. And she was diving, scrambling, trying to get out of the way. You see, it makes sense now, doesn't it? The table has to be level. And Jesus, when he talked about his tables, they were level. Everybody sat at the same table. Nobody was better than somebody else. Paul, when he talks about the early church, he shares this revolutionary concept where you have Jews sitting next to Greeks and sitting next to Romans. And do you know who else sat next to them? The slaves. The slaves sat at the same table. Nobody had even heard of a table like this. Nobody had even imagined a table. where a Jew or a Roman would sit and share a meal with a slave. But at Jesus' kind of table, it's level. Everybody does. The communion table, I think, is one of the great reminders that the kingdom of heaven is level. It's for everyone. Everyone is equal. When you come to the communion table, whether it's at the Grove or any church, and here at the Grove, I watch every week. At the communion table, we have business executives come alongside the unemployed. At the communion table, we have university professors come alongside the high school dropouts. We have people of every background and every marital status all come to the same table. The table in the kingdom of heaven is level. Sarah Miles has written this beautiful, brilliant book titled Take This Bread. And the whole book, she writes about communion, and it's stunning. And she was a new Christian, in fact, just seeking God when she moves to San Francisco, and she started attending this church. And after a few months, they invited her to be part of their communion serving team, and so she starts to serve communion. And Sarah Miles writes, she says, I noticed in San Francisco that at the communion table, everybody is equal. Nobody's better than somebody else. She says the posh socialites from Nob Hill would come to the communion table alongside the immigrant poor. She says the tech executives from Palo Alto would come to the communion table along with the homeless poor. They all came to the same table. No table was better than the other. I think for me, something that changed my view of the communion table was going out to eat in Hell's Kitchen in New York City. Veronica and I had gone there with some of our family, and when we got to this restaurant that we heard was really hip and cool, we asked for them to seat us, and so we waited, and then they said our table is ready, and they walked us to a table, and they said, you're sitting here, and there were just 4 of us. But it was a problem because there were people I didn't know sitting right here. And there were more people I didn't know sitting right here. I'd never seen this before. This was like 5, 6, 7 years ago. By the way, it's called a community table. Now you see them everywhere. I didn't know this. So I said, hey, time out. I'm one of those guys. Hey, host, I pulled her aside. We want a table just for the 4 of us. And she had to explain to me, in Hell's Kitchen, everyone sits at the same table. You sit with people. And then as we ate that night, it dawned on me, maybe heaven's going to be like this, like Hell's Kitchen, where everyone sits together. I don't know if that analogy works at all. I don't even know what to do with that. But it hit me that growing up, when I took communion, it was just a saltine cracker. Hang on. There's not even any salt on it, all right? It was just a cracker with no taste. And then we had a shot glass with Welch's. It wasn't even really a shot glass because there's no that kind of flavor in it. We were teetotaling Presbyterians. So it was just like grape juice, and it never felt like a meal. And when you read about Jesus breaking bread with his followers, it was always a full-on meal. And Jude, do you know what Jude calls this meal that the church was having? He calls it an agape feast, an unconditional love feast dinner. That's what they were having. And so after coming back from Hell's Kitchen in New York City, that's one of the reasons we have this dinner table in the Grove, because I was like, okay, we can take communion inside, and the sacrament is great, but it doesn't represent the meal that we're supposed to have, or completely. And so tonight we're going to have dinner together with friends, and you're going to have to sit next to people who you don't know. It's going to be the biggest community table ever. I hope you see what I'm saying. The table is level. Everyone in Jesus' kind of kingdom, in his kind of church, at his kind of table, everyone is wanted. The table is level. Here's another observation that I've made in looking at Luke chapter 14, is that the table is a place of healing. Look at this. And in verse 1, we're going back to the start of the passage. In verse 1, we read, one Sabbath when Jesus went to eat at the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched, and there in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of the body. And Jesus asked the Pharisees and the expert of the law, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent, crickets. So taking a hold of the man, he healed him. So the way I read it, and you can tell me later if I'm wrong, but he says right in front of him, if Jesus is sitting here, right in front of him is a man who's sick. And Jesus reaches across the table and he heals him. Do you see? That's why I say Jesus' tables become a place of healing. And maybe you're here today and you hear us talk about all the people who Jesus wants to invite into the kingdom of heaven, and you think, well, that's not really for me. I want to change your perception of who's going to be in heaven. I've done the math before. Maybe you've heard me share it. But I think sometimes the mistake a lot of us make is that we think when I get to heaven, everyone's going to look like me. And it's just not the case, because I've done the math. And if you heard me do it, let me do it again, though. Anyway, in North America, for example, there's about 260 million professing Christians. And that's a lot. But if you travel west to Asia, there's 313 million Christians in Asia. You keep traveling further west, you get to Africa, there's a booming 380 Christians in Asia. Then you keep going west and you get to Latin America, Central and South America, there's 480 million Christians. And then some of you are wondering, well, how many Christians are in Europe? And they say there's 43 Christians in Europe. I don't know how many Christians are in Europe. But do you get what I'm saying? Heaven is not going to look like everyone from North America. We're going to be the minority there. I don't want that to disappoint you too much, but that's what it's going to be like. But Jesus reminds us that the table is level. The table is a place of healing. The table is a place where he opens our eyes to see the good in everyone else. Because maybe if you think the communion table, the kingdom of heaven is just for people like you or who looks like you, it's not. And maybe at the table, he wants to heal your attitudes towards others. And maybe you come today and you've harbored bitterness towards certain segments of our population or certain groups of people in our community or certain people you work with at work. Maybe God wants to heal those attitudes today. I have a challenge for you this morning. I want to invite you to, or challenge you, to invite people into your home for dinner. This is your takeout order. This is your to-go order. To invite people into your home who maybe you've never had in your home before. I want to think about people in your life who you might think about as the other. Maybe they are of the other nationality, or maybe they are of the other income, or maybe they are of the other education, or maybe they're of the other race, but they live on your street, or you work with them every day, or they're in your gym. My challenge to you is to invite them into your home for dinner, or into your backyard for a barbecue. Because you know what happens? You know what sociologists say? When we share a meal with someone, it breaks down all kinds of stereotypes. Do you know that if you're having dinner with someone, it's impossible to remain hostile toward them and eat at the same time? You can't do that. And I challenge you to invite them into your home, because you know what happens? It makes you very vulnerable. You've invited them into the most private space, the most private part of your world. And now with love and care, you've cooked a dinner for them. And there's a chance that when you serve them this meal, they might not like it, and they'll make up an excuse and say something like, oh, I'm gluten-free. They're just lying, but maybe they'll say that. And you've put all kinds of, that's the risk. But when you take that risk, we share stories, we build community, our hearts connect, we spill drinks, and we laugh together, and we become one. That's the kind of thing that happens at the table. That's your assignment today. The table is a place of healing, and maybe today you come and maybe there's some family that needs healing, or maybe your marriage needs healing. Or maybe a friendship needs healing. It happens over the table when Jesus is there. Here's the last thought that I want to share with you this morning, and it's this: that this table that Jesus talks about, is for you. And maybe you've never quite accepted that. Maybe because of your background or your problem or your addiction, you haven't been convinced that this table is for you. Today, I want to remind you that at the Grove, maybe you've been rejected in other places, but at the Grove, this table is for you. This kingdom of heaven is for you. I had a friend in college. My twin brother and I were invited to some family friends home for Thanksgiving dinner because my family was still in Africa. And so we also had another friend from out of the country. His name was Oliver. And so I called the lady and I said, hey, I have a friend Oliver. His family's from out of the country. He can't go home, obviously. Can he come to Thanksgiving dinner with us? Well, when I asked the question, there's this long, awkward silence, long silence. And then she says, that's not going to work. I'm sorry, he can't come. She said, I don't have enough chairs. I'm like, what? I hung up and I was like, who doesn't have enough chairs? Are we serious right now? There's not a chair in the office or the kid's bedroom or the garage? Your neighbor doesn't have a chair? I'll bring a chair. We can find a chair. I think my friend Oliver ate at Noggles Tacos that Thanksgiving. I wish I had gone with him. But sometimes we don't feel like we're wanted or welcomed. And if that's ever been the case in your life, I want to say today, this place is for you. This table is for you. The psalmist David, the poet David, in Psalm 23:5, he says this, He, the Lord, prepares a table for me. God has prepared a table for you. This table is for you, not somebody else. It's for you. And maybe you've never felt like it, but today I hope you believe that. I'll end by finishing the story I started with. So going back to Liberia, I'm walking down the dusty road by the beach. The sun is now dipping into the Atlantic, and I get back to my dirty guest house with a screen door and no air conditioning, and I open it and I walk in, and there's 3 guys eating. Now, I knew they were in the house, but I had met them, but I didn't know that there was food in the house, but they're eating when I get back. And they said, oh, Palmer, why are you back so quick? And I said, well, the people down the beach, they said they had no food for me there. And they said, well, that's odd. I said, yes, it is. And they said, well, sit down and eat with us. And I looked, and their serving dishes were empty. These guys must have been hungry. Like, in the 8 minutes I was gone, they'd emptied the serving dishes. And I said, so I lied to them. I said, no, I'm fine. I was just lying. I'm fine. They said, no, seriously, Palmer. Well, there's enough here. Sit down. So I quickly agreed, and I sat down. And then one of them got a plate from the kitchen. And then he came back to his plate, and he took food off of his plate onto mine. Then he gave it to the other guy, and he added more. And then the third guy added more until my plate was full. And as I ate that night, I thought about it later, I don't think it was my full stomach that felt so good. It was the invitation to sit at the table. And that invitation is yours. The kingdom of heaven is for you. If you have in any way felt ostracized or unwelcome in any place that says they worship God, then I hope that changes here. And I hope you will help be that voice to our community. That at the Grove, we want to help bring people to Jesus' kind of table, the table that it truly is a picture of the kingdom of heaven.